On behalf of the Gender and Women's Studies core faculty, the coordinating committee, and affiliate faculty of the program, I'd like to welcome you to the second annual Korenman Lecture in Gender and Women's Studies. The Korenman Lecture series is one in which we seek to highlight the wealth of contemporary scholarship on gender that's being produced across the disciplines. This year, the lecture is co-sponsored by the English Department and the Drescher Center for the Humanities. I also want to welcome particularly new faculty women to UMBC who have joined us this afternoon by invitation. We look forward to the opportunity to meet with you during the reception after the lecture. And I also want to extend a warm welcome to our friends from neighboring gender and women's studies programs and English departments from around the Baltimore metropolitan area. This is a very exciting time for gender and women's studies at UMBC. The program is vital and growing. We have now 23 majors and about 25 minors. And last spring we saw our first graduating class of undergraduate majors. There were 5 of them. In conjunction with the lecture, we're very grateful to Dr. Armstrong, who was generous enough to meet with a group of our students earlier this afternoon who are reading some of her work in our classes to talk about her scholarly endeavor in a more informal venue. So thank you very much. And for students who are interested, we do have flyers for spring courses on the table on the side, as well as the bookstore will be selling books that, that are by Dr. Armstrong. We're also quite lucky this afternoon to have with us Dr. Joan Korenman, who's the founding and longtime director of Women's Studies at UMBC, as well as the founding director of the Center for Women in Information Technology and an emeritus professor in English. The lecture series is named for Joan, and we would not have, we know, we would not have such a vital intellectual community in the Gender and Women's Studies program, or the English department, or in humanities in general if it were not for Joan's leadership. And so, Joan, would you please stand so we can give you all a hand? Thank you again. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jessica Berman, who is the chair of the English department and a member of the Gender and Women's Studies Coordinating Committee, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you, Jessica. And please welcome President of the University, Korenman Lecture.
Oh, it's great to see everybody here and to have a full room for this talk. It's really wonderful, and it's a wonderful pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Nancy Armstrong. Nancy Armstrong is professor of English and affiliate faculty of Women's Studies at Duke University. Until this year, she was the Nancy Duke Lewis Professor of Comparative Literature, English, Modern Cultural and Media, and Gender Studies at Brown. So you know how interdisciplinary she is. She's the author of, most recently, How Novels Think, British Fiction and the Limits of Individualism, that's 2005, and also of Fiction in the Age of Photography, The Legacy of British Realism, 1999. With Leonard Tennenthouse, she wrote The Imaginary Puritan, Literature, Intellectual Labor, and the Origins of Personal Life in 1992. Desire and Domestic Fiction, A Political History of the Novel, she wrote in 1987, and she's the author of nearly 100 articles, chapters, and reprints in at least 6 different languages on literature, gender, and visual culture. And in her free time, she's also managing editor of Novel, a Forum on Fiction, and co-editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of British Literary History. Dr. Armstrong's most influential book is probably still her first, Desire and Domestic Fiction, A Political History of the Novel. By placing women and notions of domesticity at the center of the way we think about the rise of the novel and the cultural work it does, Armstrong helped shift the focus of an entire field. She argued that contrary to the standard notions of the rise of the novel, women and women's writing were at the center of its very development. She thus gave support to a wide range of scholarship on gender and literature that was to follow. As one critic put it, Desire in domestic fiction, quote, changed the way we thought about public and private, agency and oppression, writing and action, giving us a far broader sense of the cultural work that novels do as they translate political information into narratives about sex, gender, and desire. Desire in domestic fiction emphasizes not only the connection between literature and history, politics, or culture, but insists, like all of Armstrong's subsequent work, that this connection is a two-way street, that the cultural products of a society have the power to deeply influence history and the social conceptions of their time, such as those surrounding gender identity, and that asking feminist questions about the roles of women and men can help reveal social structures and cultural dynamics that would otherwise remain hidden. This is a way of reading literature and thinking about culture that has become deeply ingrained in our scholarship today and has been very important for gender studies as well as for English. I'm currently reading applications for a job we have open in the English department, and I can tell you almost all of them use some version of this sort of methodology, which surely attests to its power. Yet we can still pick up desire in domestic fiction and find it provocative and powerful today. That's the real mark of scholarly excellence, I think. It's one of the key texts of feminist literary criticism of the past 2 decades. This way of using gender analysis to help us see the mutual influence between literature and wider history and culture continues powerfully in Professor Armstrong's subsequent work. Her 1999 book, Realism in the Age of Photography, links ideas of gender, race, and empire in 19th century fiction to the rise of photography in 19th century Britain. I've made a chapter from this book required reading for my senior methods course in English for years now, because it makes clear so beautifully what interdisciplinary scholarship can add to our ways of reading, and why gender as a category of analysis is a crucial link to understanding not only literary fiction, but also the history and culture of which it is a part. And I may add, it's a book that's deeply innovative in the far-reaching arguments that it makes about the importance of photography and visual culture in the 19th century, as well as the links it creates between the ways that women were being photographed in England in that period and the rise of the British Empire. In her more recent How Novels Think from 2005, Armstrong takes on an even broader agenda, arguing that the rise and development of the novel in the 18th and 19th century was instrumental to the rise and development of our modern ideas of individuality itself. This book is less explicitly focused on gender issues, but it is clear nonetheless that feminist questions lie at the core of Professor Armstrong's claims about the way that social, historical, and cultural factors condition our very identities. In all these books, as you can tell, Professor Armstrong's work is bold, important, and sometimes controversial, yet always smart and meticulous in its scholarship. It's because of this combination that I think her work has been so significant for scholars across the disciplines, but particularly for those of us working in English and in gender and women's studies. For example, not only is her fiction in the Age of Photography required reading in my methods class, but her essay, What Feminism Did to Novel Studies, is also required reading in Carol McCann's Gender and Women's Studies methods class. And I think this is a really unusual and telling sign. There are not too many texts I can think of or writers that I can think of that would have that circumstance. I'm sure the students from both those disciplines who met together today with her can attest to the power of her work to make clear why gender analysis has been transformative in literary studies, as in other fields across the humanities. It's my deep honor to have the opportunity to introduce to you today Professor Nancy Armstrong.
Thank you. That's a lot to live up to. Really, that was beautiful. Thank you. I'm honored to be here on this occasion where how's this? Okay. I don't have to use that then? Okay. Thank you for inviting me. I've had a wonderful time talking to students here today. I'm honored to be here in your presence for this occasion, and thank you for coming. I'm honored by this wonderful audience, as well as that over-the-top introduction. I don't know how I'll live up to it. Let me say something about what I'm going to sort of dish out in the next 45 minutes, 50 minutes, I think it is on the button. This is a new project, and so it's going to be a little creaky in places. And I'm going to count on you. I don't mind if somebody raises a hand and stops me, or please write down and ask me questions, because it will help me immensely if I have the clarity that I'm supposed to have. It's because I have audiences like you to keep me honest and to force me to make connections that I'm not aware of. So please do ask me questions. What I'm trying to do here, every time I go back to Jane Eyre, which is sort of my text, in a very real way, I am Jane Eyre. Okay. From reading that novel in different ways through the years, I have evolved, I hope. And this is another such reading where I'm trying to imagine what gender does after identity politics. So it's an attempt to put gender together, to articulate it to this new body of theory that's emerging under the rubric of multitude, population, man as species, multiplicity, and so on and so forth. There's a new, I can just feel it happening out there. You know, we really aren't individuals, because these things just sort of happen. And there is a new body of theory and a new kind of concern that's clearly 21st century, that's rearing its multiple heads right now. And I'm trying to think about how to connect gender to that group of concerns. And I'm going to Jane Eyre to try to do it. So push me afterwards in the Q&A if it's not as clear. This is a kind of experiment. It's called Gender Must Be Defended. And there are many ways that can be taken, and I hope you will take it in all of them. In calling this paper Gender Must Be Defended, I was keenly aware that more than 20 years have passed since feminist scholars began using gender to scold British novels for naturalizing the kind of individual suited for liberal democracies and imperial bureaucracies. Jane Eyre is only the most striking example of a novel formally designed to show the reader exactly where the heroine, always an exemplary individual, falls below her own gender standard, and where that standard should bend to accommodate the heroine's needs and desires. In addition, and as if gratuitously, however, Jane Eyre does something extraordinary that criticism has never taken the trouble to explain. This is where this project takes off. Charlotte Bronte's novel kills off nearly everyone whom it cannot imaginatively incorporate in a community with the protagonist and her narrator. There's a terrible mortality rate in this novel. Just everybody Jane doesn't like bites the dust. The jury is still out on whether Bronte really wanted to pluck this protagonist from an initially quite heterogeneous population and use her, unpleasant creature that she often is, as an example of her culture's feminine norm. Or did Bronte want us to consider her heroine's way of performing gender an exception to that standard? Is Jane the exception or the standard? Assuming that Jane shows us what a woman must do in order to move up from one social class into another, critical commentary on the novel remains stuck on the question of whether Bronte's model society is more or less democratic because Jane does succeed in moving up. Is society better for that? Has it been transformed? I think that the question of gender's relationship to class is not the right question to address, at least not at the present moment. Instead, I want to consider how gender both detaches Jane from and involves her in a very different form of collective humanity. The Victorian novelist had no difficulty representing conflicts between segments of the population defined by class or race, for that matter. But those novelists whom we still read today were not only keenly aware of their places in a society that guaranteed rights and protections to some individuals rather than others, these novelists were also the first to acknowledge the possibility that as individuals, they were ultimately indistinguishable from mass humanity and thus utterly dispensable elements of a biological species. As a result, they made, I think the 19th century is the first that had to confront that definition of humanity. The task, as a result, they made their protagonists straddle a conceptual divide between the biological body as the envelope of a unique consciousness and membership by virtue of that same body in a dynamic and heterogeneous continuum of living flesh or species. The task for scholars and critics of 19th century fiction, as I see it, is to explain how the Victorian novel used gender to repress the mutually dependent and yet contradictory relationship between these two very different ways of being human. In two series of lectures delivered at the Collège de France in 1975-76 and 1977-78 respectively, Michel Foucault acknowledged that the kind of government he had fleshed out. It's not on? Sorry about that. Okay. Michel Foucault acknowledged that the kind of government he had flashed out in Discipline and Punish was incomplete. Can everybody hear? Okay. Writing that book apparently made him reflect at length on the loose cluster of policies and procedures to which he refers under the terms biopower and security. These policies and procedures aimed at regulating a population that 19th century authors, intellectuals, and men of business regarded as uniquely capable of sudden violent expansions and contractions. On the question of where legal institutions converge with the biopower model of with the biopolitical model of power, Foucault is not so clear. In other words, how we still today have, laws for regulating individuals, and then we have these other methods that don't work so well often. Look at Katrina, when vaccination, things that take care, that guard us as a population. And where these two come together is always fraught territory, especially in the novel. Foucault is not so clear on this, except to say that the two models coexist, have done so ever since antiquity, and imply conceptually incompatible political subjects. How do we connect the modern individual to the species to which he or she, by definition, simultaneously belongs, I would argue, was a problem for Victorian novelists and remains so for theorists of liberal democracy. And if, as I believe, popular fiction used gender to think through the relationship between these warring concepts of humanity, then that relationship poses a problem for feminism as well. This paper is divided in 3 sections, which have little subtitles so that you know that we're actually moving forward and we will arrive at an end. This is called The Limits of Gender. I'm convinced that gender has exhausted most, if not all, of its critical power as a way of reading the British novel. But I also remain true to some of feminism's early insights as reworked by those of us who then embraced Foucault. I still hold novels responsible for naturalizing the difference between masculinity and femininity. As they strove to pin on biological sex all the behaviors that fell on the one side or the other of this gender binary. Whenever I use the term gender binary, I mean masculinity v femininity. By producing so many more or less masculine men and more or less feminine women, novels also revealed the impossibility of a perfect convergence of gender and sex. Indeed, so fundamentally at odds were gender and sex throughout the modern period that the two converge only at the expense of the one or the other. Thus, a heroine's distinctive way of carrying on this struggle defines her individuality. How do you negotiate these two necessary poles of identity? If Samuel Richardson's over-controlled and controlling heroine Clarissa Harlow exposes the danger of letting gender triumph over the body, she is feminine to death, quite literally, then Bertha Mason, the mad woman whom Charlotte Bronte imprisons in the attic of Rochester's manor house, shows us what happens when the palpable physicality of sex obliterates all signs of normative femininity. Gender so conceived provides the norm that shapes Bronte's various depictions of race and class, as well as her narrator's uncompromising evaluations of individuals so depicted. By reading the novel Jane Eyre from this perspective, we participate in Bronte's struggle to make the feminine a better category both for herself and her heroine to occupy. A struggle that made that novelist and heroine irresistible models for an entire generation of feminist criticism. This affiliation caused a minor scandal. In presuming to represent everyone excluded from masculine privilege, feminist critics suppress the enormous heterogeneity on the feminine side of the gender binary. In a sense, you might say we doubly feminized those groups who seem neither masculine nor feminine in a modern individualistic sense, as we either spoke for them or assigned them to a vaguely ominous other position outside the gender binary. Such exclusion doubled the exclusion that Bronte exercised in killing off all those in her novel who wouldn't or couldn't position themselves within this binary. A number of groups, black feminists and queer advocates most notably, quickly exploited the perceived exclusivity of gender in order to lay claim to the feminine position. That's what it was about. Rather, I'm the excluded, no, I'm the excluded. Rather than counter the sexism of men, these critics set about to expose the bias of feminism itself, which assumed that the only people worth talking about were those already positioned within the gender binary. Those who could show they belonged to the feminine, namely white academic women, presumed to represent those included in the feminine solely by virtue of their exclusion from or purely negative relation to gender of any kind. Okay. So the positive feminine and what we might consider the negative feminine, those who aren't endowed with gender, were lumped together, and you know, feminism spoke for that for most of the world's population. Faced with what seemed the legitimate objections of readers who saw Jane Eyre as co-opting the position of a suppressed minority, feminism had no idea how to correct the problem. The work of reading Victorian fiction to expose the work of gender seemed to be finished, and I, along with many feminists of my generation, turned to other literary problems, photography. I come to consider this move premature. To explain why, I will draw on the lectures that Foucault delivered in 1975, titled in English, "Society Must Be Defended." These lectures emphasize what he calls biopower, an omnipresent but shadowy counterpart to his model of disciplinary power. The opening lecture contends, as does Discipline and Punish, that an earlier understanding of government's first responsibility as waging war in defense of the nation against outside enemies came to the end with the emergence of such disciplinary institutions as the psychiatric clinic, the factory, the schoolroom, and I would add the critical apparatus around novel reading. According to Foucault, these mechanisms did not put an end to the fantasy of a society under threat of invasion so much as internalize the threat. Okay, so it wasn't one nation fighting against another, it was the nation fighting against certain disruptive or subversive elements within itself. And you can see how easy this would be for England to do during the 19th century, given its imperial expansion, right? Disciplinary machinery replaced the idea that the nation was one race struggling against an invading race, whether Gauls against Franks or Saxons against Normans, with a new idea of the nation as divided internally into a super race and a sub-race. This formulation may sound a lot like the racial or class bifurcations on which novel criticism has focused, with an intensity rivaling its attention to gender. But Foucault goes on to explain this way of imagining the nation in somewhat different terms. Terms I consider especially helpful for reading 19th century British fiction. He asks us to see the subrace in question not as something separate from the body of citizens, but as something produced by and in excess of that body. Now, most of the paper is going to be explaining this. As he puts it, the nation begins to assume its modern form as, quote, the obverse and the underside of a single race appears within it. For centuries, Foucault continues, the ruling elite understood its role as defending its sovereignty against what he calls the population. During the 19th century, that way of thinking about the nation disappeared. During the 19th century, I'm repeating a sentence. During the 19th century, that way of thinking about the nation disappeared. One no longer said, as during the age preceding, we have to defend ourselves against society. It made far more sense to say, as Foucault puts it, we have to defend society against all the biological threats posed by the other race, the sub-race, the counter-race that we are bringing into existence. We are producing it. This shift in the defensive posture of government is the product of a conflict that resonates on every level, psychological, philosophical, political, a conflict between what it means to belong to some demographic group and what it means to be a species. The body that emerges in the early 19th century with the increase in urban populations, the extension of empire into the colonies, and the migration of whole demographic groups across regional and national boundaries was, Foucault continues, not a body that could be imagined as a composite of individual bodies. This is the key difference. It isn't an aggregate of individuals. That's society. Nor could it be understood as a single people, Leviathan. To the contrary, he writes, it was a new body, a multiple body, a body with so many heads that while they might not be infinite in number, cannot necessarily be counted. Clearly, this is what Thomas Malthus meant by the principle of population, and Charles Darwin by the principle of variation, a heterogeneous and mutable body whose unpredictable swings in size and shifts in character required both new modes of description aimed at assessing its productive capacity and new techniques aimed at curbing its aleatory propensities. How can gender help us think about this war within and against the population, a war waged by liberal society against an enemy that is both its own creation, thus within it, and the population of which liberal individuals are but a small part? I will be showing that Victorian fiction uses gender to establish and ultimately to suppress the vital connection between the two contradictory definitions of humanity. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault explains how the surveillance of sexuality at home and in school became essential to developing the form of self-government we equate with modern individualism. A modern individual is somebody who governs him or herself. or tries. But as he points out in Society Must Be Defended, sexuality was equally inscribed in, quote, broad biological processes that concern not the bodies of individuals, but the element, the multiple unity of the population. He identifies sexuality, in other words, at the point where disciplinary technologies and regulatory policies meet and each tries to serve the needs of the other. We can, he suggests, attribute the Victorian obsession with sexuality to the fact that the surveillance of sexuality offered a way of regulating both the impulsive behaviors of the individual body through discipline and the vicissitudes of humanity in large by means of what he calls biopower. Gender connects the two concepts of government, discipline and biopower. This is Foucault. Quote, the norm regulating human production, in his view, quote, is something that can be applied both to a body one wishes to discipline by instilling self-restraint and to a population one wishes to regularize by way of measures to control the birth and death rate. On his grand map of modern history, the concepts of humanity defined by discipline and biopower thus appear to converge in the swampy zone of indistinction that he calls sexuality. When we look at a novel like Jane Eyre with this in mind, however, the common ground between those subject to discipline on the one hand and the policies associated with biopower on the other quickly evaporates. The very proximity of the two modes of government produces a division, especially evident in the novel's ending, between a society of gendered individuals and the rest of the population. Let me read from that ending. I always go like this when I'm being an author. My Edward and I, then, are happy, and the more so because those we most love are happy likewise. Diana and Mary Rivers are both married. Alternately, once every year, they come to see us, and we go to see them. Diana's husband is a captain in the Navy, a gallant officer, and a good man. Mary's is a clergyman, a college friend of her brother's, and from his attainments and principles, worthy of the connection, unquote. Is Bronte asking us to consider this claustrophobic community relatively democratic simply because the once abject Jane now constitutes its very core? In view of the novel's high mortality rate, it would certainly seem more accurate to see this little world as a gated community, set in relation to a much larger social force bent on assaulting its boundaries. In the first half of the 19th century, many novels performed the same sleight of hand and imagined that what was in fact within society, that is, people who were, that what was in fact within society, that is, people who were not normatively masculine or feminine, existed outside and in a menacing relationship to it. The second part is called sensational continuities. And here I'm going to read a couple of novels that are not so well known as Jane Eyre, sensation fiction, like Mrs. Henry Wood's East Lynne, The Woman in White, and so on. But I'm going to use those, instead of using Jane Eyre as a model for reading the sensation novel, I'm going to use the sensation novel and then come back to Jane Eyre. The popular fiction is going to provide me with a way of reading what has become a canonical novel, okay? So tolerate some novels you might not know. The monster in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which you do know, has been called many things, but Foucault's description of mass humanity as the reappearance within a single race of the past of that race is, to my mind, the most literal description of Shelley's enduring figure. Made of parts taken from many former human beings, and with a head full of traditional literature, the monster is both human and not human. At least not human in a form that can be integrated into even the most cosmopolitan of communities. I mean, the monster puts one toe in the door and the household or the community breaks up. He represents what cannot be tolerated or taken in. Rather than a struggle of master and slave that follows the intricate pathway of dialectic to resolution, the struggle between Victor Frankenstein and his creation is staged as a confrontation between contradictory and yet interdependent ways of being human that yields only a standoff. Neither man nor monster can become human in the way the other is. As a multiplicity of bodies, united only by the natural energy which courses through its various parts, the monster bears all the signs of mass humanity recast as an individual. Being both highly literate and made all of human parts, thus all too human, and yet different in the most fundamental way from other human beings, the monster is utterly inadmissible, to the little societies that Shelley assembles for the purpose of playing out the contradiction he embodies. In later Victorian novels, we find numerous references to this monster, but very few, if any, overt representations of it. The monster is, at the beginning of Great Expectations, Frankenstein, the monster, is one of those characters that lives beyond the novel. He's bigger than the novel. But there are no more monsters quite like that in the rest of the century. Instead, as I plan to show, the mass body appears in 19th century fiction wherever women mediate the conceptually vexed relationship between individual and population. The fact that these heroines take on some of the monster's qualities tells me that novelists found it increasingly difficult as the century wore on to imagine a household capable of defending against the threat of being absorbed into the population. The protagonist of Charles Dickens's Bleak House, Esther Summerson, provides an interesting case of the two bodies in one. That is, the biological body, the monster kind of body, the multiple body, and the modern individual, the body as the metaphysical envelope of mind, consciousness, self. Passed around from pillar to post, by all rights, Esther should have vanished into the multitude. Dickens uses a succession of surrogate parents to rescue her, only then to plunge her, on reaching maturity, into the viscous substance, mud, fog, garbage, or fetid water that comes to life in each of his city novels. In the first paragraph of Bleak House, he famously introduces the question of whether individuals can be considered stable, much less separate entities. And I didn't bring enough handouts, but I passed around the first paragraph because I'm not going to read it all. And it's wonderful if you don't know it. I'm just going to refer to it. So do look down the aisle and see if you can find somebody with a handout. To do so, you will remember, he describes Londoners as jostling one another in a general infection of ill temper and losing their foothold at street corners where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since the day broke. They add new deposits to the crust upon crust of mud. And he goes on to say that the horses are sinking into the mud and dogs and everyone else. In other words, and as people become less individuals, less alive as individuals in this description, the mud, which is like this, is sort of how he imagines the population, comes to life as something that can, sort of like the Blob in that movie, could reach out and absorb people. It's very much like that. This is the big picture. Though it is most unusual for Dickens to hand over the narration of a big city novel to one of its inhabitants, he makes a point in Bleak House of sometimes showing us how modern London looks from the perspective of a sheltered young woman. When he wants to shift focus onto persons and places within the city whom she cannot see and where she cannot travel, or when infection renders Esther literally blind and speechless, Dickens hands the narration back to his all-wise and witty surrogate. Let us consider why he needed two narrators to say what he wanted to say about life in the city. Where he keeps his first-person narration within the limits of what Esther, the individual, can see, Dickens endows his impersonal narrator, his impersonal author surrogate, with a perspective capable of surveying even the invisible elements of the population. By embedding the one in the other, Dickens's account of London life displays a combination of strategic distance and tactical proximity, rivaled, to my knowledge, only by the account of South America Darwin provides in The Voyage of the Beagle. Like Darwin, Dickens offers up individuals as types or specimens that simultaneously personify entire groups and fold those groups into a rhizomatic structure where they emerge, expand, turn into something else, or shrink in the face of inevitable extinction. Both authors plunge us momentarily into a force field where bodies converge and transform one another, only then to pull us safely back into the exchange between impersonal narrator and solitary reader. I am guessing that Dickens found it necessary to see life in the Victorian city both from the inside out through Esther and from the outside in by means of a sweeping and yet probing panorama, because each of the two positions is meaningful strictly in relation to the other and is incomplete without the other, therefore. Once the population emerges as such from its peripheral position in Frankenstein and Jane Eyre to become the force field in which liberal society must defend its very existence, no single character can represent what a human being truly is. For Dickens, such being is radically in question. On her way to the city to care for a dying child, Dickens's heroine senses, this is Esther again, that she soon will become something else. So this feeling came upon me then, where I knew I was going to become something else. As she describes it, quote, "I had for a moment an indefinable impression of myself as being something different from what I then was. I know it was then and there that I had it." By it, she means the smallpox infection, soon to disfigure her face beyond all recognition, destroying the last and most distinctive sign of her lineage, her relation to kinship, her connection to any kind of family in the cultural sense of the word. Having been absorbed into the population by means of this infection, Esther finds herself, quote, "very much changed, oh, very, very much changed. At first my face was so strange to me that I think I should have put my hands before it and started back." Okay, notice, I'm using her as sort of the bridge between the two concepts of the two ways of being human, and one can barely recognize the other. While it is certainly true that the form of humanity I'm calling population more readily consumes those who cannot afford to live one family to a home, I would nevertheless argue that Esther's self-alienation is not really a function of class here. The disease that infects and disfigures her indeed exposes the artificiality of class barriers as it penetrates the domestic enclosures designed to separate property-owning people from all the rest. In other words, it invades the gated community. Nor can class account for the fact that when reconstituted as an individual, Esther is acutely aware that she had once, quote, "been very different from this." Why would Dickens have connected his heroine, to an urban population in this ultimate way, if ultimate meaning they all share certain physical symptoms of disease? Why would Dickens have connected his heroine to an urban population in this ultimate way, if not to show us that the contiguities or jostling that characterize human life, that is, when they sort of accidentally knock into each other in the city streets, mask continuities. Beneath that jostling, there are very real continuities. A potential in all of us, capable of suddenly welding a diverse population into the kind of social body that calls for the policies associated with biopower. You can look at Katrina as such a moment, where people stopped being individuals and became a population. and an embarrassment to George Bush that we couldn't care for our population. These policies are aimed neither at punishing, these policies, biopower, are aimed neither at punishing violations of the law nor at inculcating self-discipline, but at regulating surges of population, maximizing its life without concern for any particular life, maximizing life by allowing some to die. Let me provide a few examples to suggest that this moment of transformation from one way of being human to another is indeed the distinctive feature of a substantial number of Victorian novels. What Dickens accomplishes by immersing his heroine in an urban population, Wilkie Collins does in The Woman in White by sequestering two women in the country. These women, the one born into property and the other a half-wit of uncertain parentage, would seem to have very different narratives stretching before them. But the novel insists on a mysterious singularity of being, established in infancy and expressed in the uncanny similarity of their physical appearance. That similarity threatens to drag the well-born Laura Fairley after her inferior counterpart into the madhouse and from there to an ignominious grave. The relatively limited number of characters who engineer or obstruct the heroine's descent into non-identity belong to a country house community more like the little society of Jane Eyre than like the sprawling omnivorous organism of Dickens's city. Collins's characters nevertheless verge, as Dickens do, on caricature, combine in wildly incompatible ways, and live in danger of losing their positions in households organized according to gender and generation. If anything, the possibility that Laura Fairley might actually be her socially inferior twin, Anne Catherick, is more disturbing than the possibility that Dickens's Esther Summerson is several different people, depending upon the types with whom she happens to be connected at any given moment. Laura's uncanny similarity to Anne is precisely the same as the similarity between the example of gender and the exception, which is by nature outside the gender binary, or as I will explain, the difference between positive and negative femininity. Now, I think I'm going to skip George Eliot, and I'm going to go on to Eastland. I say a few words about Maggie Tulliver as being pulled against her will and, belonging in the same category as Esther Summerson. In other words, Eliot is making the same connection in Mill on the Floss. And she uses the term a stronger presence, is working its way through Maggie's body. This stronger presence has nothing to do with either rational judgment or unconscious desire, both of which divided up the 19th century individual internally, leaving it more individuated than ever before. Rather than use novels belonging to the great tradition to determine what the sensation fiction of Mrs. Henry Wood, Wilkie Collins, and even Dickens lacks in terms of psychological sophistication, that's the way it's usually done. I want to bring the narrative logic of trashier fiction to bear on a novel by someone like Bronte or Eliot. This is, I think, the best way to see what canonical novels accomplished by means of their porous and permeable heroines, namely how the heroine's immersion in something like a mass body, ungendered and ungendering, authorized the gated community toward which their narratives invariably move and often fail to reach. In the age of discipline, paradoxically, sexuality tends to escape the body and unite individuals in a single current of energy. When it operates in the transpersonal manner I am describing, sexuality seems an inadequate descriptor, both too specific and too general to explain why women who leave the household and men who abandon the public arena congeal in pairs, threesomes, or mobs to form entirely new entities. The age of discipline is also the age of the sensation novel, in which the entire plot is taken over by much the same stronger present that works through sexuality to wipe out the Tulliver family at the end of Eliot's Mill on the Floss. Here is Mrs. Henry Wood's version of the extrapersonal force that disrupts the household, featured in her sensational sensation novel, East Lynne. And East Lynne was a big novel in its day. Isabel, quote, was aware that a sensation all too warm, a feeling of attraction toward Francis Levison, and you know he's got to be a bad guy if he invokes these feelings, was working within her. Not a voluntary one. She could no more repress it than she could repress her own sense of being. She would have given half the years of her future life to separate herself once and forever from the man. So this is something that comes from outside and catches her up and puts her together with him. By giving into this somatic compulsion, she and Levison each cancel out the other's position within the gender binary. As a result, both are included in society as that which it must exclude. Okay? They are the outside on the inside, at once living and socially dead. Lest we fail to see that she still occupies the same body with Levison in this respect, the novel puts Isabel Vane through a sequence of extraordinary transformations that begins as it strips the woman of, quote, her husband, her child, her home. I want you to look and see how she's referred to in this quotation. It changes. She had cast away her good name and her position. What had she gained in return? What was she? A poor outcast. One of those, notice the pronoun has dropped out, one of those whom men pity and whom women shrink. She's just moved outside the gender binary in that sentence. A miserable, friendless creature who had henceforth to earn the bread she and the other life dependent on her must eat, the clothes they must wear, the roof that must cover them. As if the metonymic slide from woman to outcast to creature to mere life that accompanies her precipitous decline in economic status were not enough, the author subjects her heroine to a train wreck that kills her baby and disfigures Isabel herself so completely that she can re-enter the household of her husband, now remarried, and serve as governess to her own children. This move is nothing but a power play. The novel's inclusion within the house of a human element outside and hostile to it is the means of creating a subrace or life that can be allowed to die. This next section is called Outside the Gender Binary. As I asserted in opening this paper, the formal problem facing the Victorian novelist cannot be understood as a conflict between segments of the population, a conflict that could then be mitigated by either partitioning or synthesizing those groups. The problem was a matter of acknowledging two different ways of being human. To make this point, Victorian fiction situates a woman outside the portal of the modern household, where she is like Shelley's monster, a different form of being than those inside. Charlotte Bronte puts Jane Eyre in exactly this position when she has her heroine flee from a bigamous relationship to her employer, Mr. Rochester. I have to tell you, this is, a section of Jane Eyre that never made any sense to me until I started reading all this stuff about population, and then I read Darwin, and then multitude theory, which is just horrible to read. And suddenly this chapter in Jane Eyre, where it takes like 20 pages to get her off the moors and into the house with the rest of the Rivers family, made sense to me. So I'm passing that along to you. You're the victim of my insights. Charlotte Bronte puts Jane in exactly this position when she has her heroine flee from a bigamous relationship to her employer, Mr. Rochester. Temporarily caught in the same plot as Isabel Vane and other outcast heroines of sensation fiction, Jane is cast as precisely the kind of non-individual whom the modern household is designed to keep out. Homeless, ill, and near starvation, she peers in a window of the Rivers home in a tableau contrived to represent her as both insider and outcast, and compelling her to oscillate between the two states of being. Quote, "Their appearance and conversation had excited in me so keen an interest," she says of the women inside the window. "I had half forgotten my own wretched position outside, more desolate, more desperate than ever it seemed from the contrast." Here Jane occupies an extraterritorial threshold that separates the human body from its normal social status and abandons it to the most extreme misfortunes. Quote, "But I must die if I am turned away," Jane complains. Jane is a big complainer. Quote, "Not you," contends Hannah, the housekeeper. Quote, "I'm feared you have some ill plans agate that bring you about folks' houses at this time of night. If you've any followers, housebreakers and such, anywhere near, you may tell them we are not by ourselves in the house." Okay, Jane is automatically perceived as multiple and as a threat. For the first time in the novel, Jane must fight for the right to live rather than the right to live a certain way. Outsiders come in packs, and by entering a home, necessarily erase the boundaries distinguishing inside from outside, transforming that boundary into one that must be repeatedly redrawn. When a governess, Jane seems as insubstantial as her place in the various homes she occupies throughout the novel, earning her such epithets as sprite and fairy. Despite her lack of a home to call her own, Jane was not entirely homeless then and could demand recognition, even sympathy. With no such position, she now appears to those safely contained within the house as, quote, "a mere specter," Bronte's term for those who are beyond society's protection. But rather than reveal her claim to a position within the Rivers home, namely, she would have to reveal that she comes from a home and reveal her surreptitious relationship to Rochester, Jane puts this challenge to Hannah's the housekeeper, to Hannah's limited definition of the human community. Quote, "If I were a masterless and stray dog, I know you would not turn me from your hearth tonight." Does the fact that the head of this household eventually permits Jane to cross the threshold mean he grants her the right of any living creature to live? I don't think so. Before admitting her, and it takes 20 pages to get her across from whatever is outside. I mean, these are two different terrains of being. If it takes that much time, just in anthropological terms, to move her from one category to the other. Before admitting her, St. John Rivers is careful to exempt her from the subgroup of humanity that can be allowed to die. This is what he said. "She is not an uneducated person, I should think. Her accent was quite pure," he says, "and the clothes she took off, though splashed and wet, were little worn and fine." For purposes of explaining why Jane is foreign one moment and familiar the next, at once barely alive and an essential part of the family, gender will get us closer to an answer, I believe, than attending to the obvious signs of class at work here. To defend the household against the defenseless Jane, Hannah conjures up a superior counterforce. "We are not by ourselves," she says of herself and the two River sisters. "We have a gentleman and dogs and guns." The difference between the two uses of the term dog indicates the precise nature of the gulf separating the homeless Jane, who is less welcome than a masterless dog, from Hannah and the River sisters, who automatically receive the protection of the property owner, his dogs and guns. The right to keep other people out is the very foundation of masculine self-sovereignty. This negative right is the precondition in I'm stealing this right and left from Wendy Brown. The right to keep other people out is the very foundation of masculine self-sovereignty. This negative right is the precondition in turn for inclusion, as we learn when St. John Rivers silences his housekeeper. Hush, Hannah. I have a word to say to this woman. You have done your duty in excluding. Now let me do mine in admitting her. Admission returns Jane to her status as woman, who occupies the feminine position of dependency within an institution dedicated to defend femininity against the very threat that Hannah keeps at bay by invoking her master's name. It takes Bronte nearly 20 pages to get her heroine out of the inclement nature and into the haven of the parsonage. I consider the novel's labor in this respect akin to the difficulty Foucault displays in crossing over from the human subjects of discipline to the equally human terrain of biopower, from liberal self-government, that is, to policies aimed at reducing the aleatory character of the population in the name of security. So long as Foucault thinks in terms of two interlocking modes of government, this difficulty remains a puzzle. Both modes, as he explains, converge on sexuality as that which is in need of discipline on the one hand and regulation on the other. The personal policing of one's body and government policies aimed, for example, at controlling venereal disease. But the minute we consider what exactly these modes presume to govern, sexuality suddenly becomes two very different things. Discipline assumes that sexuality is contained within us and expresses itself in demands of the body that can be governed by a mind sensitive to the threat posed by those demands. By contrast, biopower assumes that sexuality is multiple rather than singular, mobile rather than stationary, and belonging nowhere, is congenitally opposed to boundaries. Sexual desire in this sense is virtually indistinguishable from thirst, hunger, weariness, or whatever must be satisfied in order for life to perpetuate itself. If the threshold separating individual from mass is nothing else but the gender binary, then the gender should be able to tell us something we don't already know about the relationship between a society of liberal individuals for whom gender is everything and populations where gender is virtually meaningless. This last section is called Negative Femininity. Going by these novels, gender does not depend on a distinction between one group and another. Jane Eyre's disappointed suitor, St. John Rivers, for example, will not perish on the burning plain of India because he has gone to live with people of another race and culture. He is destined to perish because in going to India, he will be leaving behind the household that makes him who he is. Alone, without an Englishwoman beside him and a household to defend, he is suddenly in danger of becoming neither man nor individual. Indeed, Jane's agonistic passage from such near non-being to her rightful position within the gender binary indicates that being an individual and having a gender are very much the same thing. As the heroines of sensation fiction demonstrate, the minute one leaves the protection of the household, she ceases to be a woman, which is precisely what the household defends. The novel imagines life outside the gender binary, which includes the lion's share of the people in the novel, as a state of being that cancels out kinship along with erotic object choice, leaving them with only biological process or the business of staying alive. Life outside the gender binary is understood as a negation of the feminine in a second sense as well. Dickens and Bronte evidently found it necessary to all but kill off their heroines before installing them at the center of well-defended communities. These mainstream novelists considered death by immersion in the population as the precondition for the kind of femininity necessary to sustain the form of masculinity associated with the rights-bearing individual of liberal societies. In other words, they had to demonstrate that you're nothing outside the household and your position in it in order to authorize the liberal household with masculinity in a defensive position. In thus putting femininity under the protection of men, their novels subsumed human rights in the rights of individual citizens, leaving out most of the population. And this is what's wrong with the social contract, right? Sensation novelist Mrs. Henry Wood performs the same gesture when she has her heroine run off to France with a libertine, barely survive a train wreck, and return to East Lynne as a governess hidden behind thick green glasses. Isabel Vane never overcomes her status as the living dead. She is simply taken into the home as that which it must exclude. Mr. Carlyle's militantly feminine second wife acquires positive value to the degree that Isabel, his first wife, loses it. Occupying a position within the household under these circumstances causes the wayward heroine to experience an unbearable discrepancy between her inward life, that's her term, the remnant of an individuality that once belonged to her and still inheres in this home, and a biological body that the libertine Levinson defines as belonging forever outside any household. The discrepancy kills her. In that the man of the public sphere depends on a household for physical as well as emotional sustenance, and insofar as the novel defines this household in terms of what it keeps out, the negative feminine element, as embodied by Isabel Vane, provides the semiotic foundation on which the entire edifice of liberal citizenship rests. Okay, unless there's something to keep out, to defend against, the interiority doesn't have its liberal character. To conclude this investigation of what Victorian sensation fiction did to and for popular readership, let us return to the curiously overlooked phenomenon with which I began, namely the fact that so many people die in order that Jane Eyre may acquire life as the very example of an individual, the gender norm incarnate. One could argue that all those who bite the dust, bad relatives, bad teachers, bad students, bad suitors, bad wives, are not that significant were it not for the fact that Jane herself temporarily dwells within and nearly succumbs to the fate of those elements of the population that do not display some way of belonging to the feminine, if only their disapproval of those who do not. Having certain elements of the population acquire negative value in relation to Jane as she grows increasingly feminine is the novel's way of dividing its population between two modes of being. Gender, in this case, affords a powerful means of inserting a caesura within what would seem to be a biological continuum. By thinking of the population as something outside and other than ourselves, even if it is something that can be rehabilitated, rescued, and ultimately included, I would suggest, we are reproducing that artificial caesura that divides us as liberal individuals from the population. It is now feminism's task, as I see it, to point out the link. The moment, that is, when a Jane Eyre crosses the threshold from outside to inside, from mass body to gendered identity. Those moments in the very novels that once authorized feminism can, in other words, expose what feminism formerly occluded, namely the biological continuity among the disparate elements of a population. The sensation novel, which in this respect Jane Eyre certainly anticipates, spoke to a broader readership than ever before in history. Ask of that body of fiction what resides outside the house of liberal society, what can be authorizing all the monstrous forms in which novels have taught us to imagine human beings, forms of humanity that cannot be included without bringing down the house. The sensation novel insists that simply being human puts us uncomfortably, impossibly, but nevertheless necessarily on both sides of the door. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer questions. Yes?
I haven't worked this through yet, but I really trying to figure out if the second half of the 19th century analysis is more of a conservative plane of race in terms of the German
That's right. That's right. It can't fall into it can't fall into polygenesis. It can't. I mean, the anthropological stakes are so vivid, more so for the late 19th century, the argument between the monogenesis and the polygenesis, that they can't go near that. So, yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Just wondering, where did this thesis from figures like transgender figures like Marianne, sister of Laura Polly, fit into feminine thesis, feminine parts? The woman with a mustache and the woman who nonetheless is equally educated within domesticity, and the whole question of how that interrogates or perhaps complicates this. I find it really fascinating. Maggie Tolliver, too, that's those issues with the gypsies.
Right. I even see it as early as Jane Austen now, when the gypsies surround. Yes, it isn't Emma, it's her little friend. I can't remember. Yeah, and it's there in what Edward Said points out, the fact that England isn't whole, it isn't all made of property and individuals. It's entailed to the colonies, to the Caribbean. And every Austen novel has a sort of an Althusserian tear in it, where it shows its connections, it's aware of the fact that the world made of individuals is essentially phantasmatic. That it's, being a solid, that there's a reality behind it. Raymond.
Hi, I'm just wondering, in some ways would the Let be a sort of rewriting of Jane Eyre in the sense that Mrs. Snow kind of gains admission with the point to the full, and then the novel goes on, and then there's that sort of culmination, the scene where she goes out into the crate, and it's stuff phantasmagoric, and it's a bit like the Dickens jostling, but there's all these swarming people, but she keeps describing herself as sort of spectral figure, so she's sort of
and she can't find a place. I mean, she's so crucial to me. Yeah, she's the later rewriting of Jane Eyre, and I could go on for hours. You don't want to hear about that, but she's always in danger of sort of slipping through the cracks, disappearing, and then even at the end, when she, is going to make a household with Monsieur Paul, and he goes off to the colonies to make sure that the economic basis for that household is sustained, and she sort of has her schoolroom in her house. We know you can't put a schoolroom into a house. They're two separate institutions. And the novel ends by saying, let those of sunny imagination hope that he comes back. But we know, that she ends up, the only place she can have is in that school. She cannot find, Lucy is a woman for all sorts of reasons, partly because, I didn't answer the Marianne, the sister, partly because she has some of the masculine characteristics of Marianne, who seems to me to be, neither Marianne nor Laura are individuals. Together, they are sort of intelligence and femininity, and part of what the novel is saying is that I can't play out a feminine scenario if the woman's got a rational mind. And so she breaks it into two characters, makes one masculine sister. And it's a threesome at the end, but it's not really a threesome. They don't do that in Victorian novels. It's a twosome. We all know that Marianne and Laura are one person, and that's why that dopey guy who marries Laura, who is in love, how can you be in love with Laura? So, obviously I'm on the other sister's side. Yeah.
Does Virginia Woolf herself fit into this at all? She fell out between the cracks.
Well, but she was mean, modernism is an interesting question. I mean, first of all, Woolf shows some interest in this kind of thing, I think, especially in Orlando, I would argue. That kind of metamorphosis. But it's always, I mean, whoever she is, it's very glam.
Very what?
Glam.
Oh,
But
glam.
she's never nobody until she does herself in. And I think what modernism, I think, pursues a different tactic, which is most, I guess, I haven't worked this out yet, so excuse me if I stumble a bit, but it seems to me like in the early studies on hysteria, when Freud says something about the internal Africa, that the unconscious is like an internal Africa, that it's an attempt to put back together the split human being, the biological and consciousness, to make Enlightenment consciousness capacious again, so that it can include even the body in some way, and the vital connections to the body. But you see what that does, if you interiorize the vital connections to the body, it's a way of denying the connections which Freud in his anthropology and all sorts of other places, in the uncanny, he acknowledges, that human beings just might not be individuals. That there might be such a thing as collective thought. Because, at his moment, he's arguing against that, and I think Woolf is too. And modernism is sort of the technical result of trying to take this broken concept of the individual as mass humanity and as a bubble of consciousness, and to put the body inside consciousness.
Let me just suggest that probably the voyage out is the place where this is.
That would be good. That would be
when
good.
She gets to the faraway land that we don't know where it is, that the biological takes over and she has to die. But in any case, I want to ask you about the role of the biological in all of this, because you came back to it at the end, and you were talking about this sort of biological continuity with those who are outside femininity. And so how are you thinking about gender in relation to biology? And, I'm just curious about the bigger construct.
Well, gender is the link between the Enlightenment definition of humanity, which is human equals individual, okay? Consciousness contained in an individuated body. As Locke insists, one body, one mind, right? And biology is supposed to be governed. To be free, you have to govern your body. Locke has this long thing like, if I lose control of my arm and inadvertently hit my friend, then that arm is no longer part of me because it's not under my control. So, this other concept, Darwin makes it very clear that we're not, it's not one mind in one body. It's one body, one mind floating on a sea of interconnected, evolving variations, that all life is ultimately interconnected. So that, I don't think that Darwin caused this, because certainly the introduction to Dickens was written before The Origin of Species was published. But this kind of thought, the connection to, through not just life as it exists now, but temporal too, that there's a different kind of time that governs biological life. And that individuals perishing don't really matter. And Darwin was able to say this, well, he didn't say his own daughter didn't matter, but he said that he was glad that the species would be better, because she was probably supposed to die. That's how deeply he felt that. And the thing is that gender doesn't matter when you're speaking in those terms. In The Descent of Man, Darwin gives to gender the woman's role in the selective process. All the goofy things, fashion, the peacock's tails. Because after men are through duking it out to see who's going to survive, then women step in and choose among the competitors. This is sort of like his version of Kipling, how the leopard got his spots, or how the peacock got his tail, and it's from the women choosing from these courtship rituals those that were most attractive. So I guess that's where gender enters into it, that certain men are preferred over others, but there's a way in which biology doesn't care about gender. It cares about sexuality, reproduction, but it's thinking in much larger terms. Okay, which variation is going down the tubes, which is ascendant, when is that ascendancy going to backfire and create extinction? I mean, these were questions that England had to think about at that moment. Yeah.
Well, since you're mentioning biology and Darwin, I have to ask about sort of the prior influence of Malthus and all of this, and concerns about overpopulation. And more generally, I was wondering how you see Victorian views on gender differing with prior views of England. Even going back, think about Shakespeare and gender switching and so on, and Twelfth Night and all that.
Oh gosh, that's a tall tale. Okay, let me give you just a couple. I think that with Malthus, first of all, I think there are two Malthuses, okay? There's the Malthus of the calculus, and the Victorians' use of math was really interesting. So that, 1 plus 1 is 3. In other words, the reproduction is going to outstrip the production of food. Patently not true, but I don't think that's his real nightmare. There's another way in which, if you approach it from the position, the population is uncountable. Okay, there's a way in which you can't really calculate the population, because the population as a mass seems in Malthus, this is a literary reading of Malthus, to have its own character as a mass. It's more than the sum of its parts. It's like Frankenstein's monster, it's something else. And this is present in this sort of double identity of the multitude is present in Malthus all the time. He will use generally feminine metaphors. So, the times are big with promise, or some, metaphor for pregnancy. So he will use a lot of feminine metaphors, but he's not referring to gender in that sense, okay? That I have a gender or you have a gender. Okay? It's a way of imagining another concept of humanity behaving as a species, or as something that can't be broken down into individuals. And I think that problem, for me, that problem begins with Hobbes. Actually, that's where I identify. When he works very hard to create a world that starts out as individuals warring against each other. But when in Behemoth, he has to imagine that world breaking apart. It doesn't break into individuals, it breaks into mobs, into groups that follow false prophets. Beth, Antony, Cleopatra, Timon of Athens, Lear. What happens when the head of the patrician body is decapitated, or Lear abdicates, or Antony breaks off from Caesar? When you destroy that metaphysical hierarchy. And you have very often a kind of, femininity that emerges, but it doesn't apply to female characters or anything like that. It's what could be called the form of formlessness. The, people, in Macbeth, the feast table is overturned. In Lear, there are these armies clashing by night. There's, the collapse of hierarchy, or what would later be called leveling. So I would love, if I had another career in front of me, I would start out literary history and go through looking at this kind of figuration. And then I could see the individual and the household as defenses against this, and look at literary history as always being shaped, in opposition to this problem of what happens to humanity when it becomes the problem of the fundamental ungovernability of humanity, and how that, looms. Instead of Robinson Crusoe, I do the Defoe of A Journal of the Plague Year, and so on and so forth. You could redo, I'd focus on the Gothic, go all the way through, instead of Ian Watt and the Great Tradition. So it's probably more and vaguer than you wanted. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.